Cindy James lived an ordinary life in Vancouver, British Columbia. She had graduated from nursing school in 1966, married her husband, Roy Makepeace, and they lived a simple life together. In July 1982, she and her husband separated, and by this time, Cindy had changed her field of work. She was now an administrator at a local preschool for children with behavioral and emotional issues. 4 months after her and her husband separated, Cindy James began receiving strange phone calls. At first, Cindy wrote the calls off as pranks and figured some kids were just trying to have fun. However, as the calls increased, the man on the other side of the phone began to become louder and the threats became violent. Tilly Hack, Cindy's mother, said Cindy told her she didn't recognize the voice. Quote, she said it was just a voice. Sometimes it would change the sound, and sometimes it was just whispering. Sometimes it was just nothing. Just silence. Not knowing what else to do at this point, Cindy reached out to the local police for help in making these calls stop. The investigators on Cindy's case looked into any obvious suspects first, like if Cindy had any enemies, but she told them she didn't know anyone in her life that would do her harm. What Cindy didn't know was that calling the police to investigate the matter would escalate the calls and embolden her stalker. During the next 7 years, she reported nearly 100 incidents of harassment. 5 were violent physical attacks, while others were whispering or silent phone calls. Cindy said that on some nights she could hear someone walking around outside of her home and rummaging around her backyard, but when she went out to confront whoever it was, they were already gone. Her porch light was smashed one night. On another, 3 cats were left hanging in her yard. She reported that her dog was nearly strangled to death, and she would occasionally find photographs of dead bodies in the morgue left on her car windshield. Her phone lines were also severed, so often in fact that it began becoming difficult for the Vancouver Police Department to stay up to date on the events at the home. After that, bizarre letters came to Cindy, written in letters cut from magazines, and they were left on her doorstep. During all the years of harassment, Cindy's best friend Agnes was her rock. She was the one constant in Cindy's life, and a person she felt like she could 100% rely on and trust. After all, this constant harassment was taking a serious toll on Cindy's emotional and mental state. On a cold night in January 1983, Agnes stopped by Cindy's house for a visit. When she knocked on the door but received no answer, she assumed Cindy was taking a bath or just couldn't hear her knocking. She was trying to find another way into the house when she came across Cindy, lying on the garage floor with a nylon rope tied around her neck. Cindy stated that she was going out to the garage to grab something when she was grabbed from behind and choked. When the assailant heard Agnes knocking on the door, the man left quickly. Cindy believed that if Agnes did not show up when she did and scare him off, the man would have killed her. She didn't see the face of her assailant, but she did recall he was wearing white sneakers. Due to the life-changing harassment and violence, she sold her home, painted her car a completely different color, even changed her last name. She also hired a private investigator named Ozzy Caban to find out once and for all who this person was. One of the first things Mr. Caban did was give Cindy a 2-way radio. Remember, this was before the internet and cell phones, so this was the fastest and really the only way to stay in immediate constant contact with Cindy. On January 30th, 1984, Mr. Caban heard strange sounds coming from his 2-way radio. He went straight to Cindy's house. When he arrived, he went to the front door, but it was locked. He looked in the window and saw Cindy laying on the floor with a knife through her hand. She was taken to the hospital, where she told police and Mr. Caban that all she remembered was being attacked before feeling a needle being stuck in her arm. The police investigation did not find any fingerprints at the scene, and there were no witnesses that saw the attack happen. Cindy told the police that this person who had been attacking her is sometimes accompanied by 1 or 2 other people. Sometimes there have been up to 3. Unfortunately, police could never find a suspect. The harassing calls didn't stop, but they did become very short, too short to trace. And when the calls did come, they were always when the police surveillance was off of her home. Officers had been stationed outside Cindy's home on a 24-hour surveillance after the latest attack, but incidents only seemed to occur during shift changes and when they weren't outside Mrs. James' home. As police grew more and more skeptical of Cindy James' stories, Cindy's parents believed her attacker was staying away to make police suspicious of Cindy herself. The next attack occurred on December 11th, 1985, when Cindy was found dazed and semi-conscious lying in a ditch 6 miles from her home. She was found wearing a man's work boot and glove and suffering from hypothermia. Cuts and bruises covered her body, and a black nylon stocking had been tied tightly around her neck. A needle mark was found on her arm, but again, she claimed to have no memory of what had happened. At one point, Agnes and her husband moved in with Cindy to keep her company and be there if anything were to happen. Then, on one night in April 1986, they woke to loud noises coming from the basement. When they went downstairs to investigate, they found the basement on fire, and to top it off, the phone line had been cut again. Agnes's husband Tom ran to the neighbor's house to call the fire department, but on his way to the neighbor's house, he saw a man just standing there, on the curb, staring at the home, now with smoke billowing from the basement. Tom yelled at the man to call the fire department, but the man ran off down the street and was never seen again. After an investigation into the fire, the police suspected that Cindy had staged the entire incident. Another police investigation with CindyJames at the center, but no fingerprints, no disturbances, nothing on any of the windowsills, and the fire was set inside of the house. Stranger still, during the fire, Cindy was seen walking her dog, which is pretty odd considering the circumstances. After the latest investigation ended with no results, and the evidence actually pointing at Cindy, Cindy's doctor committed her to a local psychiatric ward, believing she was becoming suicidal. Her father, Otto Hack, said that she had finally admitted to her friends and family that she knew more than she was saying. She told him that she believed she knew the identity of the perpetrator and would go after them herself, since the police haven't been able to help her. Mr. Caban, the private investigator hired by CindyJames, was still on the case, and later reported that Cindy was not telling the police the entire story. She would be evasive, withhold information, and, quote, not act as a normal victim would do so. The police even went as far as giving Cindy a polygraph test. The test concluded she was withholding information, was not being entirely truthful about the events. Her mother, Tilly Hack, thinks the reason for her reluctance to tell the police everything she knew at the time was that her attacker had threatened her family, and by naming him, her family would be killed. The next attack was on October 26, 1988. Cindy came in from work when she was attacked in her carport after attempting to exit her vehicle. She was later found unconscious in her car, nude from the waist down. Again, a nylon stocking was tied around her neck, but this time her arms and legs were hogtied with a second pair of stockings. Duct tape was found over her mouth in an attempt to keep her from breathing. After the event, she slipped into a coma, but did survive. In spring 1989, almost 6 months after the attack in the carport, which left her in a coma, she reported to her friends and family that the attacks seemed to be decreasing in frequency and viciousness. For the first time in a long time, she began to feel better about the situation. On May 25, 1989, 6 years and 7 months after the first threatening phone call, CindyJames disappeared. On the same day, her car was found in a neighborhood shopping plaza parking lot. Inside were groceries and a wrapped gift. There was blood on the driver's side door, and items from her wallet were under the car. 2 weeks later, her body was found at an abandoned house about 1 kilometer from the shopping plaza where her vehicle was found. It looked like she had been brutally murdered. Her hands and feet were bound together behind her back. A black nylon stocking was tied tightly around her neck, yet an autopsy revealed that she died from an overdose of morphine, the sedative flurazepam, and other drugs. Due to the past questioning of CindyJames's motives, the events that she said happened but had no evidence for, and the overall skepticism for CindyJames's story overall, the police concluded that she had committed suicide and closed the case in July of 1989. Mr. Caban did not believe Cindy would have been able to stage the scene. Others believe it's a possibility. In Vancouver, the coroner ruled that her death was not a suicide, not an accident, and not a murder. Rather, they determined that she died of a quote-unquote unknown event. Otto and Tilly never doubted that she was murdered. Otto believed that the police did not investigate the possibility of homicide or somebody murdering her, instead zeroing in on trying to prove that Cindy had committed suicide. They believe someone in Vancouver is walking free that should be behind bars. The event that spanned almost 7 years ended with CindyJames dead. But 33 years later, the case remains unsolved.